Come in, get comfortable, and let the day set itself down. Tonight we are going to travel together, you and I, all the way back to a river valley in Italy nearly 3,000 years ago, and we are going to stay there, unhurried, for a very long while. This is the entire story of Rome, told from its first legend to its last emperor, and it is told for sleep. Nothing here will startle you. Wars will pass by like weather seen from a warm window. Centuries will fold themselves up like blankets. If you drift off somewhere in the middle, that is not a failure of attention. That is the whole point. The story will keep unrolling gently beneath your dreams, and you can come back another night and find the part you missed still waiting for you, patient as stone. So settle your shoulders. Let your hands rest. Breathe out slowly, once, and let us begin where Rome itself begins, which is not with marble or armies at all, but with a river. Long before there was a city, there was the Tiber, a wide brown ribbon of water winding down from the Apennine Mountains toward the sea. It moved then exactly as it moves tonight, without hurry, carrying silt and leaves and the reflections of clouds. Along its eastern bank rose a cluster of low hills, 7 of them, soft-shouldered and green, covered in oak and beech and wild fig. In the folds between the hills lay marshes where herons stood on one leg and frogs sang all night long. It was good country for shepherds. In the evenings, smoke from their small fires threaded up between the trees, and the bells of their flocks made a slow, scattered music in the dusk. The people who lived there were Latins, farmers and herders who spoke an early form of the language that would one day carry law and poetry across the known world, though of course they did not know that. They knew lambing seasons and rain signs. They knew which hollows flooded and which hilltops caught the first sun, and they told stories, as people always have in the hour when the fire burns low. One of the stories they told, and kept telling for 1,000 years, reached back even further, across the sea to a burning city called Troy. When Troy fell, the story said, a prince named Aeneas gathered the survivors, carried his elderly father on his back through the smoke, took his young son by the hand, and sailed west into the unknown. For years his ships wandered the Mediterranean, resting on islands, losing their way, finding it again, until at last they came ashore in Italy, on this very coast near the mouth of this very river. Aeneas married into the local people, and his descendants ruled a small hill town called Alba Longa, generation after quiet generation, kings of a place so modest that history would barely have remembered it, except for what happened next. In Alba Longa, many generations later, there lived a king with a younger brother, and the younger brother was hungry for the throne in the way that some men are. He pushed the rightful king aside, and, to make sure no grandchild would ever challenge him, he arranged for the king's daughter, a gentle young woman named Rhea Silvia, to become a priestess, sworn never to marry. But legends have their own ideas. The story says that the god of war himself loved her, and that she bore twin sons, boys with strong lungs and dark hair, and that the frightened usurper ordered the babies to be set adrift on the Tiber in a basket, expecting the river to take them away forever. The river had other plans. It was flood season, and the water was wide and slow, and instead of swallowing the basket it carried it softly, the way you might carry something you had decided to keep, and set it down at the foot of a hill, in the roots of a wild fig tree, where the current could not reach it any more. And there, in the hush of the riverbank, came the most famous animal in all of Western storytelling, a she-wolf, grey and lean, come down to the water to drink. She found the basket. She heard the small sounds inside it. And instead of harm, the legend says, something older than harm moved in her, and she lay down beside the twins and let them nurse, and she kept them warm through the nights, and a woodpecker brought them morsels of food, and the fig tree spread its leaves above them like a roof. Picture it as slowly as you like, because there is no rush. Moonlight on the water. The wolf's ears turning at every sound, standing guard. 2 infants breathing in the dark, fed and warm, utterly unaware that empires would one day trace themselves back to this exact patch of mud and root and river mist. In time a shepherd named Faustulus out looking for a lost animal, came upon the scene and stood very still, the way you do when you see something you know you will remember for the rest of your life. He carried the twins home under his cloak to his wife, Acca Larentia, who had no children of her own, and in their small hut on the Palatine Hill the boys grew up as shepherds' sons. They were named Romulus and Remus. They grew tall and quick, good with slings and dogs and weather, the kind of young men other young men follow without quite knowing why. And when at last the truth of their birth came out, as truths do, they walked back to Alba Longa, set their grandfather back on his rightful throne, and then did something unexpected. They did not stay to wait for a crown. They went back to the hills where the wolf had nursed them, back to the shepherd country of their childhood, and decided to build a city of their own. Now every founding needs a place, and the brothers each favoured a different hill. Romulus loved the Palatine, where the fig tree grew and the hut of Faustulus stood. Remus preferred the Aventine, a little to the south. So they did what people of their time did with hard choices. They watched the sky for signs. Remus, on his hill, saw 6 vultures wheel overhead, a strong omen. But Romulus saw 12. The founding went to the Palatine, and Romulus took a plough drawn by a white ox and a white cow, and cut a furrow in a great circle around the hill, marking where his wall would stand, lifting the plough only where the gates would be. Because a gate must be crossed, but a wall must never be. It was, the Romans later said, the 21st of April, 750, 3 years before the Common Era, though tonight the date can simply be long ago, in the spring when the grass was new. And then comes the sorrow that Rome never pretended away. Remus, stung by losing the omens, mocked the little wall, and in one version of the story he leaped over it laughing, and in the quarrel that followed he was struck down, and Romulus buried his twin with grief that the legends do not try to hide. The Romans told this part on purpose, down all the centuries, because they wanted their children to know that even a city blessed by wolves and rivers is built by human beings, and human beings carry both love and fault in the same 2 hands. We will let that sadness rest now, the way Romulus laid it to rest, and watch the little city begin to breathe. It was not much to look at in the first years. A palisade of timber, round huts of wattle and thatch on the hilltop, the kind where you can smell wood smoke in everything you own. A muddy track that would in 8 centuries become a marble avenue. Romulus needed people, so he declared his city an open door, a refuge, and men who had run out of luck everywhere else came walking up the salt road to start again. Herders, labourers, debtors, wanderers, the overlooked of every neighbouring town. Rome began, quite literally, as a second chance. But a city of new beginnings had one shortage, and it was families. The neighbouring people, the Sabines, who lived in the hills to the northeast, did not care to marry their daughters into a town of strangers. What followed is an old, uncomfortable tale, told in every Roman schoolroom, of a festival and a signal, and the Sabine daughters carried off to be brides, and of the Sabine fathers arming for a war to take them back. But the ending is the part the Romans loved, and it is the part we will keep for tonight. By the time the Sabine army reached Rome, seasons had turned, and the stolen daughters had become wives and mothers, with loyalties on both sides of the wall. And when the 2 armies drew up their lines in the valley between the hills, the women did the bravest thing in the whole legend. They walked out into the space between the spears, carrying their infants, their hair unbound in mourning. And they stood there, between their fathers and their husbands, and asked them to stop. And the spears came down. Not slowly, the story says, but all at once, the way tension leaves a room. The 2 peoples merged into one city that day, Romans and Sabines together, 2 kings ruling side by side for a time, 2 sets of gods sharing the same hilltops. The valley where the armies had faced each other, that low marshy ground between the Palatine and the Capitoline, was drained in later years and paved and lined with shrines, and it became the Forum, the living room of the entire Roman world, the place where everything that matters in this story will happen again and again for 1,000 years. Romulus ruled long, and the city under him grew from a camp into a town, with laws scratched into custom and a council of 100 elders whose descendants would call themselves patricians, fathers of the city. And when his end came, the legend gives him no sickbed. He was reviewing his people on the field of the war god outside the walls, they said, when a storm rolled in, black and sudden, and a cloud came down and hid him from sight, and when it lifted he was simply gone, taken up, the Romans believed, to become a god who would watch over their city forever. A farmer swore afterward that Romulus had appeared to him on the road in shining armour and said the words that Rome would repeat to itself in every dark hour to come. Tell my people that no power on earth can stand against them if they stand together, and then ask them to be temperate and brave. However you take that story, and the Romans themselves argued about it over their wine for centuries, the little city on the hill now had something more durable than walls. It had a memory of itself. It had a wolf at its beginning, a river that had refused to drown it, women who had walked between armies, and a founder who had gone up into the weather. Hold those pictures loosely in your mind, the fig tree, the furrow, the spears lowering, and let your breathing slow to the pace of that early city at night, when the gates were barred, the fires were banked, and 7 hills of shepherds and newcomers slept under the same enormous sky you are lying under now. By the way, if evenings like this one help you rest, you are welcome to subscribe and make this a habit, one civilization at a time, but there is no need to move or do anything now. The story goes on by itself. Rome, in these first generations, was a kingdom, and after Romulus the city did something wise. It chose for its second king not a warrior but a thinker, a Sabine named Numa Pompilius, who lived quietly outside the city and did not want the job. Messengers had to go and persuade him, and he consulted the omens for a long time before he agreed, which the Romans considered exactly the right attitude for a man being handed power. Numa ruled for more than 40 years, and in all that time the tradition says Rome fought no wars at all. It is a remarkable thing to say about any city in that rough age, and whether or not it is perfectly true, it tells you what the Romans wanted to believe about themselves, that beneath all the armour there was a people who could be governed by calendars and ceremonies and quiet agreements. And calendars there were. Numa is the king credited with reordering the Roman year, adding the months of January and February, setting the festivals in their places like stones in a garden path. So that time itself became something Rome had organised. He built the Temple of Janus, the two-faced god of doorways and beginnings, whose gates stood open in time of war and closed in time of peace. And in Numa's whole long reign, they said, those gates never once had to open. Sleep near that image for a moment if you like. A small stone temple in a quiet town. 2 heavy doors, shut, lamplight on them. The sound of the river in the distance. That is how the Romans pictured peace, not as an idea, but as a door that stays closed all night long. After Numa the peacemaker came kings of other temperaments, and the little city kept growing the way a hedge grows, slowly, and then suddenly. Tullus Hostilius, the 3rd king, was a fighting man, and under him Rome absorbed its own mother city, Alba Longa, bringing its families down to live on the Caelian hill, so that the town that had sent out Romulus now slept inside his walls. The 4th king, Ancus Marcius, a grandson of old Numa, had his grandfather's taste for order. He built the first bridge across the Tiber, a wooden one, the Sublician Bridge, resting on piles driven into the riverbed, and he founded a port called Ostia down where the river meets the sea, so that salt and grain could come up to the city by barge. Think of that first bridge for a moment, because bridges mattered so much to these people that their chief priest carried the title of bridge builder. Oak planks over brown water. The knock of hooves crossing in the morning. Fishermen tying up in its shade at noon. A city is only a city when the river is no longer a wall. And from Ancus onward, Rome had 2 banks. Then came a stranger, and this is one of those turns in the story that the Romans loved to tell slowly. A wealthy man from the Etruscan city of Tarquinii, the son of a Greek immigrant, moved to Rome with his ambitious and clever wife Tanaquil, because in Etruria a newcomer's son could rise only so far, and Rome, the city of second chances, took talent wherever it found it. As their wagon crested the Janiculum Hill and the city came into view below, an eagle swooped down, the legend says, lifted the man's cap from his head, circled high and set it back down again, and Tanaquil, who knew the language of birds, told her husband that it meant a crown. He took the name Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, made himself useful, made himself trusted, and in time was chosen king, the 5th king of Rome, an immigrant on the throne of Romulus. He gave the city its first great engineering works, and here the Rome you are picturing begins to look more like the Rome of postcards. He drained the marshy valley between the hills with a huge covered sewer, the Cloaca Maxima, parts of which still carry water under the streets of Rome tonight, more than 2,500 years later. On the drained ground he laid out the Forum properly, with shop fronts and porticos, and on the flat land between the Palatine and Aventine he staked out the Circus Maximus, the long racetrack where for over 1,000 years the whole city would gather to watch the chariots run. And on the Capitoline Hill he began a temple to Jupiter, the Skyfather, meant to be the grandest building in Italy. After him, through the quiet management of Tanaquil, the throne passed to a man raised in the royal household, a man who as a child, they said, had been seen sleeping with a soft flame flickering harmlessly around his head, a sign of favour. His name was Servius Tullius, the 6th king, and the tradition remembers him as the kindest of them all, a king born of a captive servant woman who never forgot it. He wrapped all 7 hills at last in a single great rampart of earth and stone, so the city was one body, and then he did something subtler and more important. He counted his people. The first census, household by household, farm by farm, not to spy on them but to know them, and he organised the citizens so that duties and voice were shared out by what a man could carry, not merely by the family name he had inherited. The poor were counted too, and being counted in that age meant existing. The old king was pulled down at last by ambition inside his own family, and there is a dark old tale about a wicked daughter and a street ever afterward, called the Street of Crime, but we will not walk down it tonight. It is enough to say that the 7th king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, took the throne without asking anyone, and ruled without asking anyone, and taught Rome by direct experience exactly what it never wanted again. He was not lazy, mind you. He finished the great temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, and he bought in the strangest bargain in Roman legend the Sibylline books, scrolls of prophecy offered by a mysterious old woman who burned them 3 at a time until he paid her full price for the last 3. Books Rome would consult in emergencies for the next 900 years. But he judged alone, condemned alone, and made the citizens labour on his projects like servants, and the city grew very quiet around him, the way a house grows quiet around a hard master. The end of the kings came, as the Romans told it, not from a battle, but from a wrong done inside a household. During a siege at a nearby town, some young noblemen fell to boasting about their wives, and rode home by night to check on them, and the only one they found behaving with honour was Lucretia, the wife of a lord named Collatinus, sitting late among her lamps, spinning wool with her servants. Her goodness itself drew the eye of the king's son, and he later returned and did her a grave and unforgivable wrong, and rather than live with a stain she had never chosen, she called her father and her husband to her, told them the truth, made them swear the wrong would not be forgotten, and ended her own story. We will step past that grief the way you step past a closed door in a sleeping house, quietly, with respect. What matters for our night's journey is the oath. Among the men who heard it was Lucius Junius Brutus, a nephew of the king who had survived the dangerous court by letting everyone believe he was slow and harmless, his very name a joke that meant dullard. Brutus took the knife from that sorrowful room, held it up, and dropped the disguise of a lifetime, and the men around him heard a voice none of them had ever heard before, clear and cold and organised. By his oath, Rome would have no more kings. Not this king, not any king, not ever. And Rome, weary to the bone of one man's pride, agreed the gates were shut against Tarquin, who was away with the army And just like that, after 244 years, the kingdom was over. Now here is the part that makes Rome, Rome, the part that half the constitutions on earth are still quietly copying tonight. The Romans did not replace the king with a better king. They replaced him with an arrangement. Power itself, they decided, was the danger, so power must never again sleep in one bed. In place of a king, they elected 2 consuls equal in authority, each able to halt the other, and they served for 1 single year, after which they returned to being ordinary citizens, walking the same forum, answerable for everything they had done. The Senate of Elders advised. Assemblies of citizens voted. The very word for what they had built was res publica, the public thing, the thing that belongs to everyone, and Brutus himself was one of the first 2 consuls, alongside Lucretia's widowed husband. The Romans dated their whole civic memory from that year, and for the rest of Roman history, the surest way to destroy a politician was to whisper that he wanted to be a king. Of course, the old king did not simply accept retirement, and the young republic had to survive its first tests, and out of those years come 2 little stories that Roman parents told at bedtime for centuries, so it is only right that you hear them at bedtime too. The first is about a bridge. An Etruscan king named Lars Porsena marched on Rome to put Tarquin back on the throne, and his army came down on the city so fast that the only thing between Rome and capture was the old wooden Sublician bridge across the Tiber. A soldier named Horatius Cockles planted himself at the far end of it, 1 man wide as the bridge itself, and told his comrades to chop the bridge down behind him while he held the doorway of Rome. 2 others stood with him a while, then went back as the timbers groaned, and Horatius held on alone until the whole span cracked and fell into the river, and then, in full armour, he dove into the Tiber and swam home to the cheering of the walls, the river of the she-wolf holding up 1 more Roman when it counted. The second story is about a plough. Years into the Republic, an enemy army trapped a Roman force in the hills, and the city, in a panic, resolved to appoint a dictator. An emergency office the Romans allowed themselves in the worst moments. 1 man with full power, but only for 6 months, and only for the task at hand. The Senate's messengers crossed the Tiber to a 3-acre farm and found the man they had chosen, a former consul named Cincinnatus, in his field guiding his plough, dust on his hands. He called for his toga, heard them out, took command, rescued the trapped army, laid down the dictatorship, and was back at his plough before 16 days had passed. He could have kept the power for 6 months. He kept it for barely 2 weeks, exactly as long as the job required, and not 1 hour more. Rome told that story to itself for 1,000 years, and long afterward, on another continent, a general named Washington would be praised with Cincinnatus's name for going home to his farm the same way. Let those 2 pictures settle over you like a second blanket, the man on the bridge holding the door and the man at the plough handing power back. A republic, the Romans would tell you, is not held up by marble. It is held up by people who know when to stand and when to go home. And with that, the city breathes out, and so can you. The lamps are lit early in this young republic, and put out early too. In the small houses on the hills, families eat their porridge of emmer wheat, count the animals into their pens, bank the coals in the hearth, and say a word to the household spirits on the shelf by the door. Outside, the watch walks the new earthen walls, and the Temple of Janus stands with its doors sometimes open now, because a republic among ambitious neighbours cannot always choose peace. But the city has learnt the thing it will never unlearn, that it belongs to no one man. And so, in a way no king could ever make it, it is safe. The Tiber slides past the ruined stumps of the old bridge, already being rebuilt, always being rebuilt. The fig tree still grows where a wolf once did an unaccountable kindness. And the story of Rome, which was a legend and then a kingdom, is now a res publica, a public thing, a shared thing, a thing that belongs, like this quiet hour, to everyone who is resting inside its walls. The young republic now had to learn how to live with itself, and this next stretch of the story is not about enemies outside the walls at all. It is about the long, patient argument inside them, and it is one of the most soothing arguments in all of history, because almost nobody dies in it, and it ends with everyone at the same table. Rome, you see, had two kinds of citizens. The patricians were the old families, the ones descended from those first 100 elders of Romulus, and they held the priesthoods, the courtrooms, and both consuls' chairs. The plebeians were everyone else, the farmers and potters and porters and boatmen, the great mass of people who ploughed the fields and filled the ranks of the army, and who could vote, yes, but could not hold the offices, could not read the laws, which were not even written down, and could be bound over to a creditor if a bad harvest put them in debt. A man could march all summer defending Rome and come home to find his farm weedy, his debts grown, and himself at the mercy of a magistrate applying rules he was not allowed to see. For a while the plebeians grumbled, and then one year, instead of rioting, they did something magnificently calm. They walked out. The whole plebeian order, by the thousands, simply gathered up their tools and their families and marched out of the city to a hill a few miles away, the Sacred Mount, and camped there, peacefully, and waited. No forges rang, no barges were unloaded, no recruits answered the muster. The patricians stood in a suddenly silent city and discovered in the space of a few quiet days exactly how a city works and who works it. The Senate sent out a negotiator, a genial old consular named Menenius Agrippa, and rather than threats he told the strikers a little fable of a time when the hands and feet and mouth of a body grew resentful of the belly, which seemed to sit idle in the middle receiving all the food, so the limbs went on strike, the hands refusing to lift, the mouth refusing to chew, until the whole body weakened together, and the limbs learned that the belly had been quietly nourishing them all along. Crude as parables go, but the offer that came with it was real. The plebeians would return, and in exchange they would have officers of their very own, tribunes of the plebs, whose duty was to protect any citizen from a magistrate's abuse. The tribune's door stood open all night. His person was declared sacrosanct, meaning that to lay a hand on him was to be beyond the law's protection entirely, and a tribune could stop an act of government dead by pronouncing a single word, veto, which is simply Latin for I forbid. That word is still stopping governments tonight, in parliaments the Romans never dreamed of, and it began there, on that hill of tired farmers who had refused to shout and refused to swing, and had simply folded their arms. Some years later the plebeians won the next round as well. The laws themselves were finally written down by a commission of 10 men on 12 tables of bronze set up in the forum where anyone could stand and read them, or have them read aloud. The 12 tables were harsh in places, the way early law always is, but they were public, fixed, the same words in the morning as at night, the same for the powerful as for the poor, and Roman schoolboys were still memorizing them 300 years later, the way children memorize songs. Century by century, with strikes and speeches but astonishingly little blood, the plebeians worked their way into every room in the house, won consulship, then routinely won, then the priesthoods, until at last a law declared that decisions of the plebeian assembly bound the whole Roman people. Full stop. It took about 200 years, which sounds long, until you remember how most cities in most ages settled such questions. And then it sounds like wisdom itself, patience practiced at the scale of a civilization. While the orders were working out their peace, the city was becoming the strongest town in central Italy, and two great shocks, one triumph and one disaster, taught it the two lessons it would keep forever. The triumph came first. 10 miles up the Tiber stood Veii, a rich Etruscan city on a high rock, Rome's rival since the days of the kings, and after a siege that legend stretched to 10 years, the Roman commander Camillus finally took it, and Rome doubled its territory in an afternoon. Then, within a very few years, came the disaster. Out of the north, from the plains beyond the Apennines, came the Gauls. Tall Celtic warriors with long iron swords and lime-stiffened hair, moving fast, and at a little river called the Allia the Roman army simply broke, and the city lay open. The people fled to the countryside or crowded onto the Capitoline Hill, the one place with cliffs and walls enough to hold, and the Gauls walked into Rome and burned it. For months the defenders held out on the hilltop above their own smouldering city. And out of that bleak siege the Romans kept, of all things, a story about geese. The sacred geese of Juno, kept by her temple on the summit, were spared from the cooking pots even as rations thinned, and one moonless night, when Gallic climbers had found a hidden path up the cliffs, and the dogs heard nothing, the geese did, and burst into honking and wing-beating, and a former consul named Manlius woke, grabbed his shield, reached the cliff edge first, and threw the lead climber back onto the men below, and the Capitol was saved by poultry. The Romans, who forgot nothing, thereafter honoured a golden goose in procession, and they meant it. In the end the Gauls, weary and sick with camp fever, took a ransom of gold and went home, and there is a famous bitter grace note about the weighing of it. For when the Romans complained that the Gallic weights were rigged, the chieftain Brennus threw his heavy sword onto the scale too and said, "Woe to the defeated," meaning the loser does not get to audit the arithmetic. Rome swallowed that sentence and never forgot the taste. Some voices proposed abandoning the ruins and moving the whole population up to captured Veii, which stood intact and empty. Camillus talked them out of it. The city of the wolf and the river was not an address, it was a covenant, and so the Romans rebuilt on the spot, hastily, crookedly. Which is why old Rome's streets wandered like sheep paths ever after, and around the rebuilt city they raised at last a proper stone circuit. The great wall called Servian, 11 kilometres of fitted tough blocks, chest-high remnants of which still stand tonight beside a railway station, with commuters hurrying past them holding coffee. And here is the lesson Rome drew, the one that made it different from every conqueror before it. Alone, it was one town of farmers, and one bad afternoon on a riverbank could end it. So Rome stopped being alone, city by city, valley by valley, through the long wars that filled the next century, against the tough Samnite highlanders in their mountain strongholds and the old Latin neighbours of the plain. Rome bound Italy to itself not merely with garrisons, but with agreements, each community given its own carefully fitted status. Some with full citizenship, some with citizenship except the vote, some as allies under treaty, and to hold the web together the Romans built roads. Not paths, roads, engineered stone causeways running straight as a taut string across marsh and hill, with foundations like walls laid on their sides. The first and most famous was begun by a blind old censor named Appius Claudius, the Appian Way, arrowing south from Rome toward Capua and eventually the heel of Italy, and the same Appius built the city's first aqueduct as well. A covered stone channel bringing sweet water in from the hills, the first of 11 that would one day pour rivers into the city's fountains day and night. Rome was learning its true genius, which was never really the sword. It was the network. It was the habit of turning yesterday's enemy into tomorrow's partner, with a paved road between them and a shared water supply at the end of it. The last test of this young Italian confederation came from across the sea, and it wore purple. The Greek cities of southern Italy, feeling Rome's shadow lengthen, invited over a professional, King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a cousin of the great Alexander's line, with a modern Greek army and 20 war elephants, beasts no Roman had ever seen, towering and grey, turning cavalry horses inside out with terror. Pyrrhus beat the Romans once, and then beat them again, and after the second victory, surveying the field where so many of his irreplaceable veterans lay, he said the sentence that made him immortal in every language: "One more victory like this, and we are finished." The Romans, meanwhile, replaced their losses from that deep Italian well of allied manpower, refused every peace offer while a foreign king stood on Italian soil, and simply persisted. And within a few years Pyrrhus sailed home, reportedly remarking what a beautiful battlefield he was leaving behind for Roman Carthage to fight over one day. He was more right than he knew, but that is for a little later in our night. By now Rome held Italy from the Po Valley's edge to the toe of the boot, and yet if you had walked its streets you would have found not a gleaming capital, but a working town, brick and timber, loud by day and dark by night. So let us end this chapter of the journey with an evening there, somewhere in those years, in a small house off a crooked lane. The shutters are drawn, the floor is swept earth, or if the family has done well, a simple mosaic of river pebbles. Dinner was pulse, the eternal wheat porridge, with cabbage and a little cheese, eaten by lamplight, one flame swimming in olive oil. The father checks the bar on the door. The mother sets a saucer of porridge on the little shelf of the household gods, the lares, small bronze dancers who guard the family. Because in Rome the gods were not distant, they lived on your wall and shared your supper. The children whisper on their mattresses about the golden goose, in the procession they saw at the festival. Somewhere up the hill a watchman calls the hour. And along the new stone road outside the gate, the last cart of the evening rolls south with its load of clay lamps and its sleepy driver. Following the straight grey stones toward Capua under a sky deep with stars, every mile marker counted, every bridge sound, the whole peninsula slowly knitting itself together in the dark, like a great quiet loom that has decided, without anyone quite announcing it, to weave a world. Across the water from Italy, on the coast of North Africa where the sea narrows, there stood a city older than Rome, and for most of their shared history, far richer. Carthage had been founded by Phoenician sailors from Tyre, traders who thought in harbours and cargo manifests, and by this point in our story it was the commercial mistress of the western Mediterranean, with a navy that treated the sea between Sicily and Spain as a private lake. Its harbour was a wonder of the age, an outer basin for merchantmen, and, hidden behind it, a perfectly circular inner harbour ringed with covered ship sheds, where 220 warships could rest in the shade like horses in their stalls. Carthaginian captains had sailed past the gates of the Mediterranean into the open Atlantic, north toward Tin Country and south along the African shore. Rome, at this same moment, did not really have a navy at all. For centuries the two cities had been polite to each other, signing treaties, trading, staying out of each other's weather. But between them lay the island of Sicily, wealthy, wheat-rich, and divided. And when a small crisis in a Sicilian port town spiralled, as small crises among great powers will, Rome and Carthage found themselves for the first time on opposite sides of a fight neither had exactly chosen. The struggle that followed lasted, on and off, 23 years, the longest continuous war of the ancient world, and we will let its battles blur past like rain on the window, keeping only the marvellous stubborn heart of it. Rome, the land animal, decided it would simply have to learn the sea. A Carthaginian warship ran aground and was captured, and the Romans took it apart the way a curious child takes apart a clock, and used it as a template to build 120 copies in 60 days. Crews learning to row on wooden benches set up on dry land while the hulls were still being nailed together. And because they knew Carthaginian sailors would outsteer them for years to come, the Romans changed the question. They fitted their ships with a boarding bridge, a hinged gangway with an iron spike beneath its far end, so that when an enemy vessel swept close to ram, the bridge slammed down, the spike bit the enemy deck, and suddenly the sea battle became a land battle on a floating floor, which was the only kind of battle Romans knew how to win. They called the device the corvus, the raven, for the way it pecked down. With it, the farmers beat the sailors in their own element, and those storms drowned more Roman fleets than Carthage ever sank, and though the treasury ran so dry that the last fleet was paid for by private citizens lending their silver to the state, Rome simply built again and again, and at last Carthage signed a peace, and Sicily became the first Roman province, the first piece of Rome that was not Italy. The peace held for a generation, and in that generation a Carthaginian general, who had never accepted the verdict, took his family to Spain to build a new power base among the silver mines, and the story says he led his 9-year-old son to an altar and had him swear never to be a friend of Rome. The boy's name was Hannibal, and he grew into perhaps the most gifted battlefield commander the ancient world ever produced. And when the Second War came, he did the thing no one sane had budgeted for. Rather than wait for the Roman fleets, he went overland, out of Spain, across southern Gaul, and up into the Alps, in autumn, with tens of thousands of soldiers and a string of war elephants, threading passes where the snow lay old and grey beneath the new, prying boulders off the track, losing men to cold and cliffside and ambush, and coming down at last into the Po Valley with an army thin to a blade, but tempered like one. For the next 15 years, this man fought the entire Roman world from inside Italy, without a supply line to home, and never lost a major pitched battle on Italian soil. Rome's answer, when courage kept failing, was an old man's patience. The dictator Fabius Maximus refused to be drawn, shadowing Hannibal's army along the high ground, pinching off his foragers, declining battle week after week, while the crowd back home jeered him as the delayer, Cunctator, a name meant as an insult that history quietly polished into a medal. Impatience won out once, disastrously, at a place called Cannae, where Rome sent the largest army it had ever fielded straight at Hannibal, and his thin centre bent and did not break, while his cavalry closed the back door, and the great host was swallowed whole in a single August afternoon. It was the kind of blow that ends nations, and every ally of Rome was watching to see the ending. But this is where all those patient centuries of road building and citizenship deals paid their dividend, because the core of the Italian Confederation did not defect. The gates stayed shut, the levies kept coming, and Rome, which had lost more grown men in one day than some kingdoms possessed, refused with an almost eerie calm to discuss terms. The Senate went out to formally thank the surviving consul, the one whose rashness had helped cause the disaster, for not despairing of the Republic. Land where Hannibal's army was camped came up for auction in the Forum, and sold at the full ordinary price. You may find, some difficult week, that you remember that detail. A city buying its own occupied fields at face value, betting on its own future with its coat off. Slowly the tide turned, as tides do, not with one wave but with the moon's whole pull, and Rome found at last a commander of Hannibal's own vintage, a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had survived Cannae as a junior officer and had spent the years since studying the master the way an apprentice studies over a workshop wall. Given Spain, he took it. Given Africa, he crossed to it, which forced Carthage to call Hannibal home after all those undefeated years in Italy, and on a plain called Zama, the two greatest soldiers of the age finally faced each other and met beforehand, alone between the armies with only interpreters. Two professionals paying each other the compliment of trying to make the battle unnecessary. It was fought anyway, and this time it was the Roman line that held and the Carthaginian that broke, and the long war ended with Carthage still standing but clipped, its fleet burned in the harbour, its wars thereafter requiring Rome's permission. Scipio took the surname Africanus and went home to discover what every Roman hero of the Republic eventually discovered, that his city loved him best at a modest distance. Hannibal, for his part, spent years as an able civic reformer in peacetime Carthage, then wandered the courts of the East one step ahead of Roman envoys, an old lion with no country, and the two men are said to have met once more, years later, at a dinner in the East, where Scipio asked him to name the greatest generals of all time, and Hannibal listed Alexander, then Pyrrhus, then himself, and when Scipio, laughing, asked where he would rank if he had beaten me at Zama, Hannibal answered, "Then I would be first," which was the most graceful compliment ever wrapped inside a boast. Rome was now, almost without meaning to be, the strongest power in the whole Mediterranean, and the second act of that transformation happened at the other end of the sea, among the old and glittering kingdoms left over from Alexander the Great. We can take this part gently. In one breath, the phalanxes of Macedon met the legions and lost. The kings of Syria met them and lost, and one by one the proud Greek East learned the new grammar of the world. But something subtler flowed back along those sea lanes, and it mattered more than the tribute. Greece itself came to Rome in shiploads of statues and libraries and tutors and physicians and philosophers, and the conquerors sat down, a little sheepishly, as students. Roman senators' sons learned Greek as a matter of course. Roman playwrights adapted Greek comedies for festival stages. A poet later put it perfectly: captive Greece took her rough captor captive. And so the city of shepherds and soldiers began, in these years, to become something it had never planned: a civilization with two languages, Latin for law and command, Greek for science and beauty, a double heartbeat it would keep to the very end of our story. There is one more Carthaginian chapter, and it is a sad one told quickly and quietly, as sad things sometimes must be at bedtime. A generation later, with old fears stoked by old men, one senator famously ending every speech, on any topic, with the words "Moreover Carthage must be destroyed," Rome picked the third and final quarrel, and this time nothing was left standing. And the survivors were led away, and the city that had taught the West how to sail was unmade. Even the Roman commander, watching it burn, wept and quoted Homer's line about the fall of Troy, and admitted to a friend that he was weeping for Rome, because cities, he said, all cities, have their day. Keep his tears somewhere safe in your mind tonight. They belong to the honest half of this story, the half that always knew that greatness is a lease and not a deed. And then let the image soften, and step back onto the long roads of Italy, where the mile markers glow faintly in the dusk, and the grain barges ride low in the Tiber, coming up from the sea with wheat from Sicily and Africa, and the city on the 7 hills. Now the capital of an accidental empire lights its 100,000 little oil lamps one by one, like a hillside of settling fireflies, and gets ready as we are for the deep middle of the night. Victory, it turns out, is a stranger houseguest than defeat, and the next 100 years of Rome's story are about a republic learning that the hard way. Wealth came flooding in from the provinces, tribute and taxes and silver and grain, and it did not settle evenly. Senators, forbidden by law from commerce, poured their fortunes into the one investment allowed them: land, and across Italy the little family farms, the 3-acre plots of the Cincinnatus kind, were bought up or squeezed out and merged into vast estates worked by gangs of enslaved labourers captured in the wars. The sturdy ploughman soldier who had been the Republic's foundation drifted to the city, landless, and Rome swelled into something no one had planned, a metropolis of hundreds of thousands, brilliant and crowded and increasingly full of citizens, with the vote in their hand and not much else in it. Into this widening crack stepped 2 brothers, and the Romans never stopped arguing about them, which is usually the sign of people who mattered. Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were aristocrats of impeccable stock, grandsons of the great Scipio Africanus himself, raised by their formidable widowed mother Cornelia, who when other women showed off their pearls would call in her sons and say, "These are my jewels." Tiberius, the elder, riding through Etruria as a young officer, noticed something that unsettled him: mile after mile of great estates and chained field gangs, and hardly a freeborn farmer anywhere, and he asked the question out loud that everyone had been avoiding: where exactly are the future soldiers of Rome supposed to come from? As tribune of the plebs he proposed something that was actually old law dusted off. That public land, the land won by everyone's wars, should be capped per holder and the surplus parcelled out to landless citizens. The great landholders in the Senate saw the arithmetic of their own estates and balked, and the struggle over that one bill bent the constitution in ways it never quite unbent. Tiberius deposed a fellow tribune who kept vetoing the vote, then stood for re-election to protect himself. Each step arguably legal and unmistakably new, and at last a mob of senators and their men came for him with broken bench legs, and the blood of a tribune, the one person all Roman custom held untouchable, was spilled on the Capitol. It was the first political killing inside the city in the Republic's whole long memory, and like a first crack in a dish, every later break would follow its line. His younger brother Gaius took up the work a decade later, brilliant, fast-talking, a whole reform programme in one man, subsidised grain for the city, roads and colonies, courts rebalanced, even the astonishing idea of citizenship for Rome's Italian allies, and he too was hounded to his end, and after him the Senate learned the fatal shortcut of declaring an emergency and settling arguments in the street. Politics in Rome now had a body count, and everyone pretended it was temporary. Meanwhile, the army was changing underneath everybody. A rough-hewn general named Gaius Marius, a farmer's son from the hill country, with no ancestors to speak of, no Greek polish, and a genius for war, was elected consul and unheard of 7 times. And to fill his legions he did the practical thing, and dropped the property requirement entirely, enrolling the landless poor, equipping them from the public purse, and promising them land when they mustered out. It worked splendidly. It also quietly rewired the loyalty of every Roman army from the Republic to the general who signed for its pensions. And that rewiring is the single wire along which the rest of this story runs. Marius used his armies well, destroying 2 wandering northern nations that had annihilated Roman forces and terrified Italy for a decade. But he grew old jealously, and his former lieutenant, an aristocrat named Sulla, cold, charming, lucky, and utterly unsentimental, was handed the plum eastern command that Marius wanted, and when the politicians in Rome contrived to strip Sulla of it, Sulla did the thing that could not be taken back. He turned his 6 legions around and marched them on Rome itself. No general had ever crossed the sacred boundary of the city under arms. His own officers deserted him in shame, all but one. The soldiers, the new landless soldiers whose futures were tied to his, followed him in. And though Sulla went east afterward and won his war, and though the years in between were ugly with the countermarkers of Marius's faction, the precedent now existed like a loaded weapon left on the common table, and every ambitious man in Rome for the next 50 years would glance at it while talking. When Sulla came back and took the city a second time, he had himself appointed dictator, the old emergency office of Cincinnatus, but without the time limit, and what followed was the grimmest season the Republic had yet known, the proscriptions, lists posted in the forum of men who could be harmed with impunity, their property forfeit, and we will not walk through those months. Only note that Rome learned what fear tastes like when law itself goes dark. And then Sulla did the one thing nobody predicted, stranger in its way than any of his crimes. Having rebuilt the constitution to his liking, strengthening the Senate, shackling the tribunes, he laid the dictatorship down, dismissed his guards, and walked the forum as a private citizen, daring anyone to call him to account, and no one did, and he retired to the coast to write his memoirs and died in bed. Julius Caesar, then a very young man who had defied Sulla once and survived it, is supposed to have remarked that Sulla did not know his political alphabet, meaning that a man who had held ultimate power and simply handed it back had missed the entire point. Keep that little remark in your pocket. It is the seed of everything that follows. But the Republic was not only politics, and before we ride into its famous last act, it is worth lying back and remembering that most Romans in these loud decades were not marching anywhere. The census counted about 1 million citizen men across Italy. In the towns, life thickened pleasantly, theatres went up, bathhouses opened their steamy doors to anyone with a small coin, and the roads hummed with commerce. In the city, tenement Rome was noisy and precarious, but there was free grain now, and festivals filling 1/3 of the calendar, chariot races where 150,000 people gasped in one voice. And on summer nights whole neighbourhoods hauled their stools outside to eat melon and gossip in the alleys, because the apartments held the day's heat like ovens. Scholars wrote handbooks on farming and grammar. Cicero, a country gentleman's son from Arpinum, with the finest speaking voice of the age, was proving in the courts that a new man with no famous ancestors could rise to the consulship on words alone, and his letters, hundreds of which still exist, show us a Rome of dinner parties and book borrowing and real estate complaints and worried notes about a daughter's health, which is to say a city of human beings, recognizable at any distance, most of them wanting exactly what the people on your street want tonight: supper, safety, someone to talk to, and a little sleep. There was one more shadow in those years that should be named honestly, because Rome's prosperity rode on it. The estates and mines and households ran on the labour of enslaved people. taken in the wars by the hundreds of thousands, and they were not resigned to it. 3 times in 70 years great uprisings shook Italy and Sicily, and the last and greatest was led by a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus, who broke out of a training school at Capua with 70 comrades and some kitchen knives, camped on the slopes of Vesuvius, and within 2 years was marching an army of the escaped 70,000 strong or more, up and down the whole peninsula, defeating one Roman force after another. It took 8 legions under Crassus, the richest man in Rome, to end it. And the ending was merciless, and we will let it pass in silence rather than in detail. The Romans told the story ever after as a lesson about fear. Told at this distance, at this hour, it lands differently, as the oldest human insistence there is, spoken in torchlight on a volcano's shoulder, that no one is born to be property. The Republic did not hear it. The Republic was busy. Its 3 most powerful men, Crassus with his money, Pompey the brilliant general whom men called the Great after his eastern conquests, and that same Julius Caesar, now grown into the most agile politician in the city, had discovered that by pooling their influence privately, they could pass over the Senate's head anything they liked. Their informal pact ran Rome for a decade, and it bought Caesar the thing he wanted most. A province with legions and time, the whole of Gaul, and a war to make his name. The lamps are burning late in the Forum as the 17-year-old Republic's crisis turns 50, committees arguing, orators pleading, everyone half aware that the old shared thing, the res publica, is creaking under men grown larger than its rooms. Let their voices fade now into the general murmur of the city at night. Cartwheels, fountains, a dog somewhere, a night watchman's greeting, and rest here a moment, because beyond this darkness waits the most famous Roman of them all, and a small cold river in the north, and a choice. Gaius Julius Caesar was 50 when he changed the world, and nothing about his first 40 years made it obvious he would. He came from one of the oldest families in Rome, so old it claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, and so faded that it had produced no one of consequence in living memory. He was tall for a Roman, sharp-faced, fastidious about his appearance, famously fussy about his thinning hair, charming in a way that survives even in the hostile sources, and he spent his youth as a fashionable spendthrift, borrowing colossal sums against a future no lender could quite see. What the lenders were actually buying, it turned out, was a mind of frightening completeness, a man who could dictate letters to 2 secretaries at once while riding, who wrote the cleanest Latin prose of his century between battles, and who never in his life seems to have panicked about anything. Even the pirate story people told about his youth had that signature calm. Kidnapped at sea and held for ransom, he told the pirates cheerfully that their asking price was insultingly low for a man of his quality, suggested they raise it, spent weeks reading them his poems and promising to come back and deal with them, and after the ransom freed him, he did exactly what he had promised, returning with ships to settle the account, unhurried and precise. In Gaul, through 8 years of campaigning that stretched from the Atlantic to the Rhine and twice across the water to the mysterious island of Britain, he made himself the most famous man alive, sending home dispatches written in a cool third person that every literate Roman devoured, and building, soldier by soldier, the kind of army loyalty that Marius had invented and Sulla had cashed. When it was over, Gaul was a Roman country in the making, and Caesar was rich beyond his debts, adored by his veterans, and precisely as dangerous as his enemies in the Senate said he was. Those enemies made a decision that scholars still argue about at conferences. They refused him the one thing that would have kept the peace: the right to stand for consul without first disbanding his army and returning to Rome as a private citizen, where the waiting lawsuits would have ended him. Pompey, once his partner and son-in-law, now stood with the Senate. The tribunes who vetoed the ultimatum fled north to Caesar's camp, dressed as servants. And so, in the early darkness of a January morning, Caesar came to the boundary of his province, a shallow, reedy, entirely unimpressive stream called the Rubicon, the legal line no general could cross under arms, and stopped, and by torchlight talked quietly with his officers about the price of standing still and the price of moving, and then said the sentence that gamblers have quoted ever since: "The die is cast," and rowed across the little water. And the last civil war of the Republic had begun. We will keep the war itself soft and far away, like thunder over the hills. It ran 4 years and crossed the whole map, Italy taken almost without a blow as towns opened their gates, Spain won by manoeuvre, Greece by endurance, and the decisive field at Pharsalus, where Pompey's larger army broke, and the great Pompey himself fled to Egypt, where, before Caesar could even land, courtiers of the boy king had him ended on the beach, hoping to please the winner. They had misjudged their man. Caesar wept when they showed him what they had done, and had the murderers dealt with. Whatever else history says of him, he did not care to be handed his rival's life by strangers. What he found in Egypt, besides grief, was a 21-year-old queen locked out of her own capital by her brother's faction, and the story insists she reached Caesar by having herself carried through the palace gates, rolled inside a bundle of bedding, unrolled at his feet, and stood up talking. Cleopatra VII was Greek by blood, the last branch of the dynasty Alexander's general had planted, the first of her whole line who had troubled to learn the Egyptian language, and by every account her beauty was the least of it. It was the voice, the wit, the 9 languages, the company. Caesar settled her firmly on her throne and lingered a season on the Nile, and their son was born the next summer, and Rome gossiped itself hoarse. But Caesar came home, and the work he did in his brief months of peace tells you what kind of ruler the world lost. He reorganized the calendar itself, with help from an Alexandrian astronomer, replacing the Republic's hopelessly drifted lunar year with a solar one of 365 days, and a leap day every 4th year. The Julian calendar, which is, with one small later correction, the calendar sitting in your phone tonight. The 7th month took his name. July, he founded colonies for his veterans and the urban poor, restarted Carthage and Corinth as living cities, planned a public library for Rome, drained marshes, reformed the debt laws with a moderation that startled everyone, and pardoned his defeated enemies with a sweeping, deliberate clemency that no victor of the previous 50 years had even attempted, restoring them to their ranks and their careers as though the war had been a misunderstanding among gentlemen. It was his proudest policy, and it was the one that ended him, because the men he pardoned kept their pride along with their lives. He accepted honours that fit no republican shelf, dictator for 10 years, then dictator perpetually, his face on the coinage while he lived, a gilded chair in the Senate, and though he theatrically refused a crown when his lieutenant offered one at a festival, pushing it away twice while the crowd roared approval of the refusal, enough men in the old families concluded that the substance was already there, whatever the label said. Some 60 senators, many owing him their lives, resolved that the Republic could only breathe if he stopped, and on the 15th of March, the Ides, in the month named for the war god, they gathered around him at a Senate meeting in the portico attached to Pompey's theatre, crowding close as petitioners do, and there, at the foot of his dead rival's statue, they did their work quickly. He was 55. The tradition, which grows in the telling, says that when he saw among them a young man he had loved and favoured like a son, he stopped resisting, drew the fold of his toga over his face and let it come with dignity, and even his enemies agreed the last gesture was very like him. The tidiness, the refusal to be seen undone. He had dined the evening before at a friend's table, and when the conversation turned, as if the house itself knew, to the question of what kind of death was best, Caesar had looked up from the wine and answered first, the unexpected kind. The men of the Ides called themselves the Liberators, and stood in the forum with their blades up, waiting for the grateful Republic to bloom back around them, and instead there was silence, shutters closing street by street, because the crowd of Rome had loved Caesar, whatever the Senate felt. And when his will was read aloud and the city learned he had left his gardens to the public and a cash gift to every citizen, grief turned to fury, and the funeral crowd burned his body in the forum itself, on a pyre built from the benches and doors of the square. and the liberators within weeks were liberating themselves out of Italy. The republic they had killed for did not come back. It had not really existed for 50 years, except as a beautiful manner of speaking. What came instead was 13 more years of struggle to inherit him, and we will pass through them like a night train through hill country, seeing only the lit windows. His ablest lieutenant, Mark Antony, soldierly, generous, theatrical, took the east and took up with Cleopatra where his chief had left off, and theirs became one of the few political alliances in history that was also unmistakably a love story, with all the poor judgment that implies. Against him stood the person absolutely no one had budgeted for, Caesar's 18-year-old great-nephew Octavian, a thin, sickly student adopted as son and heir in the dead man's will, who arrived in Italy against all advice, claimed the name Caesar, borrowed against it to pay his adoptive father's promised gift to the citizens out of his own pocket when the politicians stalled, and proceeded, over the following decade, to outthink every adult in the room. The final act came at sea, off a promontory in western Greece called Actium, where the fleets met and Antony's cause came apart, and he and the queen slipped away south to Egypt, and, when the last door closed a year later, ended their own stories, she, the tale insists, by the bite of an asp smuggled to her in a basket of figs, dying crowned and unconquered in her own way, the last pharaoh of Egypt, 3,000 years of that title closing with her. Octavian stood alone amid the wreckage of the Roman world, 32 years old, master of every legion, every province, every treasury, holding in his hands the exact totality of power that his adoptive father had been killed for approaching. And what he did with it is the next chapter of our night, and it is, whatever else one thinks of him, one of the most interesting answers ever given to the oldest political question there is. For now, let the sea settle after Actium. Let the palace lamps in Alexandria go out one by one. Respectfully, the Mediterranean, for the first time in anyone's memory, has no fleet on it looking for a fight. And around its whole enormous rim, in 1,000 ports, sailors are sleeping, and the age that is coming will be named, in every language, after the quiet, the Roman peace. The young man who now owned the world had watched, since childhood, every powerful Roman of 2 generations be destroyed by the very appearance of wanting what he now actually possessed. And the solution he found was so simple and so strange that it took his contemporaries years to understand what had happened. He gave it all back. In a carefully staged session of the Senate, 4 years after Actium, Octavian formally laid down his emergency powers and restored the Republic, the consuls, the courts, the provinces, the whole beloved antique furniture, and the Senate, in a rapture of gratitude, immediately begged him to keep supervising a few things, merely for stability, merely the frontier provinces, which happened to be where nearly all the legions were stationed, and voted him a new name, Augustus, an old religious word meaning something like the revered one, a title that had belonged to no man before. And so the arrangement settled into place like a well-made lid. Rome remained, on paper and in ceremony, a republic, with elections and magistrates and the Senate meeting as always, and Augustus held no crown, wore no diadem, lived in a deliberately modest house on the Palatine, slept in the same small bedroom for 40 years, called himself simply Princeps, the first citizen, the first among equals. He was consul when elected, held the tribune's protective power, which the loyal assemblies renewed, and if all else failed, the soldiers of every province had sworn their oath to him personally. It was, depending on the light, either the restoration of the Republic or the most elegant sleight of hand in political history, and it was both. And it worked for 200 years. The wars stopped. Let that sentence have a moment to itself, because nothing in this whole night's story is bigger. From Spain to Syria, within one lifetime, the Mediterranean world, which had known essentially permanent warfare since before anyone's great-grandparents, went quiet. The gates of the Temple of Janus, which had stood open for war in all but 2 brief moments across 700 years, were ceremonially closed 3 times in Augustus's own reign. Merchants could now sail from Cadiz to Alexandria under one law, one coinage, one navy sweeping the sea lanes clean of pirates, and a traveller on the great roads passed from province to province, without a border, without a change of money, without much of anything except new landscapes and new accents serving the same wine. The empire under Augustus ran to perhaps 70 million people, one human being in every 4 or 5 alive on earth. And for the mass of them, the farmers of Egypt and Gaul and Anatolia, who had been taxed and trampled by every passing army for centuries, the Roman peace was not propaganda. It was the first calm their families had ever known. Augustus governed it like a careful estate manager. He counted everything, 3 times in his reign a census of the whole Roman world, one of which, you may remember, is the reason a certain carpenter and his wife were travelling to Bethlehem in a story told every December. He organised a permanent professional army of 28 legions stationed out along the rivers and deserts of the frontier, with fixed pay, fixed terms, and a pension in land or cash at the end. No more private armies, no more generals' debts. He created the city's first police and fire brigades, 7,000 watchmen organised by district, patrolling the tenement streets at night with buckets and lanterns. He built roads and repaired the aqueducts through his tireless friend Agrippa, the plain-born general who had actually won Actium for him, who now spent the peace building baths and gardens for the public and the Pantheon's first version, and whose name is still carved across its porch tonight. And Augustus rebuilt the city itself so thoroughly, 82 temples restored in a single year by his own count, marble facing climbing over the old brick and tuff, that his remembered boast, polished by the historians, was that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Around him gathered the writers who would give Rome its permanent voice, sponsored by his wealthy friend Maecenas, whose very name became the word for a patron of the arts in a dozen languages. Horace, the freedman's son who wrote the odes everyone would quote forever, seized the day, trust as little as possible in tomorrow. Livy, who spent 40 years writing the whole history of Rome from the She-Wolf onward, the very legends you heard at the start of tonight's journey, preserved because this generation wrote them down. And above them all Virgil, shy, slow-working, country-hearted, who spent 11 years on a single poem, the Aeneid, the epic of that Trojan prince Aeneas whose wanderings began our story, carrying his father out of the fire, carrying his household gods toward an Italy he had been promised, but would never himself see settled. Rome wept over it precisely because it was not a simple victory song. It was full of the cost of things, the line every schoolchild learned, there are tears in things, and mortal matters touch the heart. Virgil, dying, asked that the unfinished manuscript be burned. Augustus, for once disobeying a dying wish, ordered it published, and for that one act of imperial disobedience the world has been grateful for 2,000 years. The emperor's own household gave him less peace than the empire did. His only child, his daughter Julia, witty and warm and reckless, ended banished to an island by her own father's laws on public morals, a grief he carried visibly. The grandsons he had adopted and groomed died young, one after another, and the succession passed by elimination to his stepson Tiberius, a capable, saturnine man whom Augustus respected and did not particularly love. The Empress Livia, his wife of 51 years, managed the household through it all with a discretion so perfect that history has never stopped speculating about what it concealed. And in the late summer of his 76th year, at Nola in Campania, in the same room where his natural father had died, Augustus felt the end coming, called for a mirror, had his hair arranged, and asked the friends around him, in the theatre manager's Greek of the old comedies, whether he had played his part in the farce of life well enough, and if so, would they kindly give him their applause as he exited. Then he sent them out, held Livia's hand, and told her to remember their marriage, and was gone. The Senate declared him a god, which he had carefully arranged to deserve. The machine he built ran on without him, which he had arranged even more carefully. He had taken a republic that could no longer govern itself without civil war, and hidden a monarchy inside it so tactfully that peace became ordinary, and the price, which Romans would total up quietly for centuries, was that the res publica, the public thing, was now, behind all its beautiful, preserved ceremonies, one man's household. Whether that was rescue or theft is a question you are allowed to fall asleep on, and the Romans themselves never settled it. What they knew was the quiet. A merchant in Gaul could order glassware from Syria and reasonably expect both the glass and the invoice to arrive. A farmer's daughter in Spain grew up, married, kept her accounts, and grew old without ever seeing an army. In the city, 1 million people now, the night belonged to the delivery carts, because Caesar's old traffic law banned heavy wagons by day, so all night long Rome rumbled and clattered softly with produce coming in, cabbages and amphorae and building stone, wheels on paving stones like a long steady rain, and the poets complained adorably that the racket kept them awake, in the way people complain about problems that are really blessings. Fresh water fell in the fountains on every corner, all night, every night, no hand turning it on or off, gravity alone carrying it down from hills 30 miles away through channels laid truer than a modern laser line. If you had stood on the Palatine in the last years of Augustus and looked out over it, the lamplit bowl of the Forum, the dark ribbon of the river with its wharves, the far grid of streets breathing smoke and murmur, you would have been looking at something genuinely new under the moon, a world, for the moment, at rest. Let yourself stand there a while now. There is no hurry at all. The watchmen are making their rounds with lanterns, the fountains are running, the carts are rolling their slow thunder up from Ostia with tomorrow's bread inside them, and somewhere below in a small house a lamp goes out, and then another, and the first citizen of the world's small bedroom goes dark like all the others, one window among 1 million. Which was, if you think about it, the whole trick, and the whole achievement, and the reason the peace held. Breathe in slowly now, and out again, the city is doing the same. The system Augustus left behind had one flaw he could never engineer away, and it was the succession, because a monarchy that officially did not exist could not have an official heir, only a best-placed relative. And the story of the next century is the story of one remarkable family, the Julio Claudians, handing the hidden throne down through its own tangled branches with results that range from competent to catastrophic, while the empire itself, and this is the astonishing part, hummed along largely unbothered underneath. Tiberius, the stepson, ruled 23 years and was good at every part of the job except being liked. A first-rate general and a careful steward who left the treasury fuller than he found it, he loathed the ceremonies, the flattery, the crowds, and eventually he did something no ruler of the world had done before. He moved out. The last decade of his reign he governed by correspondence from a cliff-top villa on the island of Capri, and Rome, buzzing with rumour about the absent old man, learned an uneasy lesson about how well the machine ran without anyone visibly driving it. He was followed by his grandnephew, a young man history knows by his childhood nickname, Caligula, Little Boots, given to him as a toddler by his father's adoring soldiers when he toddled around camp in a miniature uniform. He began well and then, after an illness, became a byword, and we will not spend our quiet hour cataloguing it, only say that the stories of horses nearly made consul and wars declared on the sea itself may be hostile gossip or may not, and that after not quite 4 years his own guards ended the experiment, and in the panicked hours afterward the Praetorian Guard, searching the palace, found a middle-aged scholar hiding behind a curtain, trembling. The family's embarrassment, a man with a limp and a stammer whom everyone had overlooked for 50 years, which is precisely why he was still alive, and they hailed him emperor on the spot, partly, the historians hint, as a barracks joke. The joke ruled 13 years and ruled well. Claudius, the limping scholar, who had spent his life writing histories no one read, turned out to have absorbed more governance from his books than his glittering relatives had from their tutors. He built a great artificial harbour at Ostia, so the grain fleets could unload in all weathers, drained lakes, extended citizenship generously to provincials, and added a whole new province in person. Sailing to oversee the conquest of Britain, the misty island Julius Caesar had only raided, and spending 16 days there while his legions took the southeast, elephants included, to the bewilderment of the Britons. He was, the ancients agreed, absurd and shrewd in equal measure, and his reign is the best argument in the whole story for never judging a person by their curtain-hiding moments. His stepson Nero came to power at 16, and for 5 years, guided by his tutor the philosopher Seneca, the government was praised even by its enemies, and then the guidance failed, and the reign curdled into vanity and worse. An emperor who performed on stage while senators hid their expressions, who eliminated his own mother, and under whom, one hot July night, a fire broke out in the shops at the end of the Circus Maximus, and, fanned by wind, burned for 9 days until 10 of the city's 14 districts were damaged or destroyed. Rome rebuilt with wider streets and fireproof building codes that architects still nod at respectfully. But the whispers that Nero had sung of Troy while the city burned, true or not, and the enormous golden palace he built on the cleared land, were the beginning of his end, and when the armies of the provinces finally renounced him, he ended his own life with the perfectly in character last words, "What an artist dies in me." He was the last of the family of Caesar and Augustus, and the year after him taught the empire in one brutal seminar what actually held it up. 4 emperors in 12 months, each raised by a different army, until the commander of the Eastern legions, a tough, frugal, joke-cracking mule breeder's grandson named Vespasian, took hold of the whole thing and simply refused to let go. The secret was out. The historian Tacitus wrote, "An emperor could be made elsewhere than in Rome." The dynasty of Vespasian and his sons gave the empire the building it is known by above all others. On the drained lake of Nero's private golden palace, returning the stolen ground to the people in the most pointed way imaginable, Vespasian raised the Flavian Amphitheatre, the Colosseum, a stadium for 50,000, faced in travertine, honeycombed with stairways so well designed that a full crowd could empty in minutes, floored in sand over a basement maze of lifts and trapdoors, and crowned, on hot days, with a vast sailcloth awning rigged by a detachment of naval sailors who ran the rigging like a ship's crew in the sky. What happened on that sand was often cruel, and we will not dwell there. The age was what it was. But the building itself, bones bare tonight under the same moon, remains the most recognizable structure the Romans ever made, and his son Titus opened it with 100 days of spectacle. Titus's short reign carried 2 disasters borne well, another fire, and, in the late summer of his first year, a mountain in Campania that no one alive knew was a volcano cleared its throat. Vesuvius had slept for centuries, wearing vineyards up to its very summit, and the elegant seaside towns around its feet. Pompeii with its 20,000 people, its bakeries and fountains, its election slogans painted cheerfully on the walls, little Herculaneum on the shore, had no word in their local vocabulary for what began on an August midday, a column of ash and pumice rising. The naturalist Pliny recorded, like an immense Mediterranean pine, trunk and spreading crown, miles into the sky. His uncle, the elder Pliny, admiral of the fleet across the bay and the most famous scholar of the age, sailed toward the darkness rather than away, to observe and to rescue, repeating to his frightened helmsman that fortune favours the brave, and he died on that shore, notebook habits intact to the last, and his nephew's 2 letters describing it all are the first volcanology in human history. The towns were buried, Pompeii under pumice and ash, Herculaneum under floes that sealed it like wax, and here is the strange soft mercy that belongs at bedtime, that burial became preservation, and 17 centuries later diggers began to find the whole ordinary world intact. Loaves of bread still in the oven with the baker's stamp legible, a dog's mosaic in a doorway reading "Beware of the dog," cups on tables, ruts worn by cartwheels, scribbled sums, a whole day of common life held safe as if under glass. So that of all the places in the empire, the 2 towns that ended are the ones where Roman life can still, in a way, be visited. and scholars who study them will tell you the feeling is not horror, but tenderness. The same tenderness you might feel tonight thinking of it. Everything small and human, saved. Titus died young and beloved. His brother Domitian ruled long and grimly, and ended by assassination. And the Senate, given one clean chance, chose next not a dynast, but a mild, childless old lawyer named Nerva, whose single great act was the one that unlocked the empire's best century. He adopted, as son and successor, the finest soldier of the age, chosen for merit and not for blood, and in doing so founded the run of rulers that a later historian would call the 5 good emperors, under whom, he judged, the human race enjoyed its happiest and most prosperous era. Whether or not that famous verdict survives modern footnotes, something real lies behind it, and we are about to walk through it slowly. The empire at noon, the world of Trajan and Hadrian, but the lamps of this chapter are burning low, so let it close with the city catching its breath after its hard, dramatic century. The new amphitheatre standing enormous and pale in the moonlight where a private palace had been. The harbour lights of Ostia guiding the grain in, and up in Campania, the mountain quiet again above the sealed towns, holding its buried bread and its painted walls in trust, unknowingly, for us. Trajan came from Spain, the first emperor born outside Italy, a provincial officer's son raised in the camps, and Rome adored him from the first week to the last, so completely that for centuries afterward the Senate's formal blessing on each new ruler was the prayer that he be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. He looked the part, tall, weathered, plain-spoken, marching on foot with his men and fording rivers beside them, and he had the rarer gift of wearing total power lightly, walking the city unguarded, visiting friends when they were sick like any neighbour, answering the Governor Pliny's endless administrative letters, personally, patiently, sometimes with a visible smile between the lines, as when he gently talked him out of a scheme for organising firemen into clubs, on the grounds that clubs in that province always turned political. Under him the empire reached the widest it would ever be. His engineers threw a mile-long bridge across the Danube on 20 stone piers, a thing no one would match on that river for 1,000 years, and his wars across it brought home a treasure that paid for a building spree Rome had never seen. A vast new forum, markets rising in a 5-story curve of brick that people call the world's first shopping mall, with only slight exaggeration, and in the middle of it a column 100 Roman feet tall, wrapped in a spiral ribbon of carved scenes from the Danube Wars, 2,500 figures, soldiers building forts, loading boats, dressing wounds, listening to speeches, an entire war diary in stone that stands complete tonight in the middle of Rome with the emperor's ashes once resting in its base, and if you ever stand under it, you will notice what visitors always notice, that most of the ribbon shows not fighting, but work, digging, hauling, building. Which is, whether the sculptors meant it or not, the most honest portrait of what Roman power mostly was. He also did something quietly ahead of his age, expanding a scheme of public funds that paid for the upkeep of poor children in the towns of Italy. Thousands of them, girls included, fed and raised on the interest from state farm loans, because, as the coins put it simply, they were the hope of Rome. Trajan died old, on campaign in the east, and the succession passed to his ward and kinsman Hadrian, and the empire changed key, from a march to a long thoughtful walk. Hadrian was the most curious human being ever to hold the office, a Spaniard like Trajan. But where Trajan was a soldier who governed, Hadrian was an architect, poet, painter, mathematician, and inspector general of everything, who spent more than half his 21-year reign travelling, not conquering, inspecting, province after province, walking the forts, auditing the granaries, climbing Mount Etna to see the sunrise, sketching buildings, wearing local dress, growing a Greek philosopher's beard that scandalised clean-shaven Rome, and then became the imperial fashion for a century. He made the decision that took more nerve than any war. He stopped. The empire, he judged, was finished, complete, and his work was not to stretch it, but to perfect it. So he gave back Trajan's easternmost conquests, fixed the frontiers, and walled them, most famously across the narrow neck of northern Britain, 73 miles of stone curtain from sea to sea, studded with mile castles and turrets, garrisoned by units from Syria and Spain and the Rhineland whose soldiers' letters dug from the waterlogged ground near the wall in our own time. Include an invitation from one officer's wife to another to please come to her birthday party, in a woman's handwriting, the oldest we have in Latin, and a family's note sending a soldier warm socks. That is what the edge of the world actually sounded like. And in Rome he rebuilt Agrippa's old Pantheon as the building that architects have been quietly worshipping ever since, a plain brick drum from the street. And then you step through the bronze doors, the very doors, still swinging on their original hinges after 19 centuries, into a single round room under a coffered concrete dome, 142 feet across, unreinforced, unmatched in size until the 20th century, with one opening at the crown, a perfect circle of open sky, the oculus, through which sun and rain and moonlight fall as a slow-moving spotlight across the marble floor, which is gently dished with hidden drains, because the architect knew the rain was coming and decided to welcome it rather than fight it. People stand in that room tonight, as you are lying in yours, and go quiet without being asked. Hadrian's restlessness had its shadows, a temper he fought all his life, a grief he never hid when his young favourite drowned in the Nile, harsh judgments in his last sick years, and a war in Judea whose sorrow outlasted the empire itself, and the Romans, weighing all of it, gave him the strangest epitaph in the imperial line, calling him, in one breath, the most various of men. He built himself a tomb by the Tiber so massive that it serves to this day, converted, as the fortress castle of the popes. And on his deathbed he wrote, or is said to have written, the one poem everyone remembers. 5 small lines to his own departing soul. Little wandering gentle soul, guest and companion of my body. Where are you off to now? Somewhere pale and stiff and bare, where you will make none of your usual jokes. An emperor of the whole earth, at the end talking to his soul like a beloved travelling companion at a station, and teasing it. Let the lamps dim on that, on the wall in the north with its birthday letters and warm socks, on the circle of sky in the dome with its patient floor drains, on the column wrapped in pictures of soldiers building bridges. Because the empire at noon was, more than anything else, an enormous act of maintenance, and it is deeply restful to know that for a while, under men who treated it as a trust, the maintenance was simply done. The roads mended, the children fed, the water running, the letters answered, the socks sent north in time for winter. Before we meet the philosopher on the throne, drift with me once around the whole empire at its height, the way a night wind might. Because you have earned a slow look at the thing all these centuries built, and there is no better hour for it than this one. Begin in the far northwest, in Britain, where the wall's sentries have just changed watch, and well south of them, in the soft valleys, country villas lie under the drizzle with their shutters fastened, and beneath the floors of the best rooms, in channels of warm air, the smoke of a slow furnace is circulating. The hypocaust, central heating, tended by a sleepy stoker, so that a merchant's family at the empire's coldest edge sleeps, warm-footed on mosaic, while the rain combs the orchard. Slide south across Gaul, over farmland quilted silver by the moon, along rivers where the barges are tied up too deep, wine going north, wool going south, and every few miles on the great road a mancio, an official inn, stables full, lamps low, a government courier asleep with his satchel chained to his wrist. For the imperial post can move a letter 50 miles a day for week after week, and a merchant's order scribbled in Lyon will be filled in Naples within the month. Cross the mountains into Italy and pause a moment over the Bay of Naples, where pleasure villas stand along the water like pearls on a string, and the fishing boats are out with torches, and then go east, skimming the Adriatic, over the packed theatres of Greece, empty now and holding the day's warmth in their stone, to the third city of the world, Antioch in Syria, where the main avenue runs for miles between marble colonnades and, wonder of wonders, is lit at night, oil lamps burning down the whole glittering length of it. so that Antiochenes stroll and shop and argue philosophy at midnight, and pity everyone else on earth, who merely sleeps. South of it the caravans are kneeling their camels outside Palmyra, the desert bride, whose merchant princes post agents 1,000 miles east, and further east still, at the empire's very edge, Roman customs officers on the Euphrates are sealing bales that began the year in China. Silk that has passed through so many patient hands that neither end of the chain quite believes the other exists. The Romans guessing silk grows on trees, the Chinese chroniclers writing wistfully of a great empire in the far west, orderly and rich, which they called De Qin and never once managed to visit. Swing down across Judea and its lamplit hill towns into Egypt, where the grain fleets load at Alexandria beneath the Pharos, the lighthouse whose fire, stacked 400 feet in the air on its tiers of white stone, has been the last thing 1,000,000 sailors saw at night for 4 centuries, and where, in the great library's daughter halls, a scholar named Claudius Ptolemaeus has been mapping the stars you may be able to see from your own window right now, cataloguing over 1,000 of them, drawing the constellations that are still printed on the star charts of tonight. Then run west along the African shore, the empire's warm southern rim, past Cyrene's Sylphian meadows and the amphitheatres of Libya standing up against the desert like seashells on a beach, past Carthage, rebuilt and thriving, second city of the West, its students famous for rowdiness, its orchards famous for figs, and out at last to the Pillars of Hercules, where the Atlantic breathes against the harbour moles, and the garum factories of southern Spain sleep in their salty perfume, sending the whole Mediterranean its favourite fish sauce in stamped amphorae, the way certain small regions now send the world its favourite hot sauces, and olive oil from the Spanish valleys travels to Rome in such quantities that the discarded shards of its jars have built an entire artificial hill in the capital, Monte Testaccio, a mountain made of empties, which picnickers will one day climb without knowing it is a warehouse receipt 50 metres tall. And knitting every one of these places to every other, the roads, 50,000 miles of paved trunk routes, and 5 times that in branches, marked every Roman mile by a stone pillar counting the distance, so that a traveller could stand in the dark anywhere from Scotland to Arabia and know exactly how far he stood from the golden milestone in the Forum. And along those roads tonight, in this imagined hour, the empire's letters are moving. A soldier's pay query, a mother's worry, a poet's thank you note, an order for roof tiles, a love letter to a girl in Verona, thin wooden leaves and papyrus scraps folded and sealed, tens of thousands of ordinary voices in transit through the dark, none of them historic, all of them human, the actual substance, when you weigh it honestly, of a civilization. That is the machine the good emperors inherited and tended, less an empire, on nights like this, than a single enormous household breathing in its sleep, and the man whose job it now became to keep every room of it warm was, by nature, the least imperial soul in the whole story. A man who would honestly have preferred a library carol and a wool cloak, and it is time you met him properly. Hadrian chose as his heir a wealthy, serene senator named Antoninus, on the condition that Antoninus in turn adopt 2 promising boys, and the elder of those boys is the one the world remembers. But let us not hurry past Antoninus himself, because his 23 years are the stillest water in the whole Roman story, a reign so free of catastrophe that historians complain politely about having. Nothing to write. He never left Italy. He lowered taxes, gave from his private fortune in hard years, and earned the surname Pius partly for the old-fashioned devotion he showed his adoptive father's memory, and when he lay dying at his country villa, an officer of the watch came in as always for the night's password, and the old emperor gave him the word equanimitas, even-mindedness, calm of soul, and turned over as if to sleep, and that was the end, the gentlest exit in the imperial line, a password you are welcome to borrow tonight. The elder of his adopted sons had been marked out since boyhood, a grave, gentle child the Emperor Hadrian had nicknamed the truest one, and he came to the throne in middle age as Marcus Aurelius. and his luck was the reverse of his adoptive father's. For every quiet year Antoninus had enjoyed, Marcus was handed a loud one: floods, a plague carried home from the east by the army, the great smallpox-like pestilence that emptied whole districts, and, for the first time in generations, serious war on the northern rivers, tribes pressed from behind by movements far out on the steppe, pushing across the frozen Danube. He, the most unwarlike man ever to hold the office, a philosopher by every instinct, spent most of his reign in an army coat in the mud of the frontier, doing his duty because it was his. And at night, in camp, by lamplight, he wrote, in Greek, not for publication, not for us, a private notebook of self-instruction that survived by pure chance and is known now as the Meditations. And it may be the only book by an absolute ruler that people still read to become better rather than more powerful. In it, the master of the world reminds himself to get out of bed when he does not want to, because he is getting up to do the work of a human being, reminds himself that anger does more damage than the thing that caused it, that the best revenge is to be unlike the one who injured you, that everything he owns is a loan from fortune, and that when a task is heavy he should ask himself only, is it necessary, and do it, the way a fig tree makes figs, without announcing itself. Soldiers were dying of plague around him, his co-emperor died, 8 of his 13 children died, and the notebook never once complains. It only keeps adjusting its grip, patient as a man retying a knot in the dark. If the empire at noon had a soul, it was that lamp in that tent. He died at the war, at 58, and his last recorded instruction was to go to the rising sun, for I am already setting, and with him something did set, because his son Commodus, born to the purple, rather than chosen for merit, ended the century of adoptions, made peace quickly, and spent his reign on spectacle and self-worship, renaming Rome after himself in his last unmoored years, and when he was gone, the auction and scramble that followed proved the old lesson about the armies all over again. But before we ride down into the harder years, come walk one evening in the city at its fullest, because this, not the palace, is what all those emperors were actually maintaining. It is dusk in Rome, sometime in the good years, and 1 million people are settling like a vast flock of birds. You are in a narrow street in the Subura, laundry lines overhead, the walls 6 stories high on either side, brick and timber apartment blocks called insulae, islands where nearly everyone lives, shopkeepers on the ground floor closing their shutters with a long wooden rattle, the smell of bean stew and frying oil drifting down from 100 small braziers, though the real cooking happens at the corner cook shop, the thermopolium, with its counter of sunken jars, because most apartments wisely have no kitchen fire at all. The schoolmaster is dismissing the last of his pupils from a rented porch, boys and a few girls with wax tablets under their arms. At the fountain on the corner, the last water jars of the day are being filled, and the overflow runs off down the gutter to rinse the street. The aqueducts never stop, and their soft rope of falling water will be the neighbourhood's white noise all night. Up the hill the great baths are in their final golden hour, and if you had gone in this afternoon with your small coin, children free, you would have moved with everyone else, senators and stonemasons alike, through the warm room and the hot room and the bracing cold plunge, past the exercise yard with its grunting weightlifters and the ball courts and the 2 libraries, Greek on one side, Latin on the other, under acres of mosaic and glass, and you would understand why a Roman, asked to define civilization, might simply have pointed at the building. Dinner in the apartments is bread, cheese, olives, figs, the eternal bean stew, watered wine, perhaps a little grilled fish, eaten near the window for the light. Down at street level and night, watchman lights his lantern. Rich houses are locking their doors, the lairs on their little shelf receiving a pinch of meal, and in the tenements people are dragging mattresses near the windows for the cool. Then the sound changes, the day gate opens somewhere, and the carts come in, the nightly thunder, wine from the hills, marble for a temple porch, cabbages, always cabbages, and the whole city lies in the dark listening to its own supply lines rumbling past below, the least romantic and most dependable lullaby in the ancient world. 2,000 years from this evening, people will pay for recordings of city rain to fall asleep to, and they will be listening, without knowing it, for Rome. Sleep is general over the empire, the sentry on the northern wall changing watch under the same stars as the fisherman beaching his boat at Alexandria. And in a tent on the Danube a tired man in his 50s writes one more line to himself by lamplight before bed, something he will never know we read: when you have trouble getting up in the morning, remember that the bees do not make speeches about making honey, and puts out the lamp, and the whole long day of the 2nd century closes its eyes. The years after Commodus began with a scramble and settled, as Rome's crises usually did, on a soldier, and this one came from Africa. Septimius Severus was born in Leptis Magna, a prosperous city on the Libyan coast of mixed Punic and Italian stock, which means, if you follow the thread back far enough, that a descendant of Carthage's world now ruled Rome, and history allowed itself a small smile. He was blunt about what the office had become. Where Augustus had wrapped power in 2 centuries of republican tissue paper, Severus, dying at York in cold Britain after 18 effective years, gave his sons the whole formula in one sentence: be good to each other, enrich the soldiers, and ignore everyone else. His sons did not manage the first clause, and the elder, known to history by the nickname Caracalla, after the hooded Gallic cloak he liked, ruled alone, harshly, but left behind 2 things worth carrying into your sleep. The first is the most famous bathhouse ever built, the Baths of Caracalla, a leisure complex for 1,600 bathers at a time, whose vaulted halls were so vast that when architects in New York, 17 centuries later, needed a model for the concourse of Pennsylvania Station, they simply borrowed these baths, so that millions of commuters have hurried, without knowing it, through a Roman afternoon. The second is a single law, issued in the year 212, by which every free inhabitant of the empire, from Britain to Arabia, became at a stroke a Roman citizen. His motives were probably fiscal, citizens paid certain taxes, and the historians of the time shrugged at it. But stand back and look at what it meant. A Gallic boatman, an Egyptian weaver, a Syrian shepherd woman, tens of millions of people whose ancestors Rome had conquered, waking up one ordinary morning as Romans, with a Roman's name and a Roman standing before the law. The city of second chances, which had begun as a refuge for herdsmen with nowhere else to go, had finally, after 9.5 centuries, extended the wolf's strange adoption to everyone under its sky. And it happened just in time, because the sky was darkening. The half-century that followed is called by historians the crisis of the 3rd century, and we will do with it what you do with a storm at night: stay inside, keep warm, and let it be weather. The ingredients all arrived at once: plague again, coinage debased until the silver was a whisper of a wash-over bronze, and prices ran wild. New and better organised enemies on 2 frontiers at the same time. A resurgent Persia in the east, and great new confederations of Gothic and Germanic peoples along the rivers. And, worst of all, the old Roman disease returned: armies making emperors. In 50 years, some 24 men wore the purple officially, and dozens more claimed it. Generals raised on one frontier racing their legions toward another usurper, while the border they had left leaked behind them, an emperor actually captured alive by the Persian king. A thing that had never happened. The empire for a dozen years splitting into 3 as Gaul and Britain ran themselves under one breakaway regime, and the eastern trade cities rallied around the desert queen Zenobia of Palmyra, who ruled from Egypt to Anatolia in her own name and minted her own coins. And yet, and this is the quiet miracle worth falling asleep on, the thing did not die. The towns walled themselves and carried on. The wheat still moved. Local magistrates still heard cases under portico roofs while the purple changed hands somewhere far away, and out of the Danube armies, in the 70s of that century, came a run of tough Balkan soldier emperors who stitched it all back together, above all Aurelian, a career officer of legendary severity and speed, who in 5 years, one reign of 5 years, defeated the northern invaders, took Zenobia's east back with unusual gentleness toward the queen herself, who was paraded in Rome and then, in the better version of the story, pensioned off to a villa near Tivoli, where she grew old as a society hostess, recovered the breakaway West, reformed the coinage, and telling the truth about the New Age in stone, wrapped the city of Rome itself, which had outgrown its defences 6 centuries earlier and never bothered to replace them, in a new circuit of high brick walls 12 miles around. Because the unthinkable now required budgeting for. Those walls still stand around old Rome tonight, nearly complete, and traffic pours through their ancient gates every morning. Aurelian soldiers called him Restorer of the World, and for once the coin slogan was simple accounting. The storm ended, formally, with another Balkan soldier, an ex-ranker from Dalmatia of obscure birth named Diocletian, and he was something rarer than a saviour. He was a reorganiser, the kind of mind that looks at a heroic mess and starts making lists. The empire, he concluded, had become too big for one man to hold. The distances alone defeated you. News of a Rhine crossing and a Persian raid arriving the same week at opposite ends of the world. So he did the un-Roman thing, and shared deliberately on a schedule. He took a co-emperor for the West while he kept the East, and each of the 2 seniors, called Augustus, adopted a junior called Caesar. 4 rulers, 4 capitals near the frontiers, none of them Rome. A system called the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4, and for 20 years it worked. The 4 moving like a well-drilled fire brigade, always one of them within reach of any trouble. He multiplied the provinces into smaller, more governable pieces, separated civil from military command so no governor could easily go rogue, tried with comic futility to freeze inflation by decreeing maximum prices for everything in the market, from wheat to lion cubs to a lawyer's fees. A law the markets politely ignored, and wrapped the office of emperor in Eastern court ceremony, the diadem, the robes, the kneeling, deciding that since the republican disguise had long since worn through, majesty at least might deter assassins where modesty had not. His record has one deep stain that should be named plainly and briefly. In his last years he unleashed the empire-wide persecution of the Christians, the harshest Rome ever conducted, and it failed, and we will see in a moment just how completely. But his ending has no parallel in the whole story. In the year 305, aging and tired, Diocletian did what no Roman emperor had ever done. No Sulla-style pause, the real thing, he retired, voluntarily, formally abdicating in front of his weeping army, and went home to the Dalmatian coast, to an enormous fortified palace he had built by the sea near where he was born, and grew vegetables. Years later, when the tetrarchy he had built was creaking, and old colleagues wrote begging him to take the purple back and save it, he wrote back, in effect, the most content sentence a ruler ever produced. If you could see the cabbages I have planted with my own hands, you would not ask me to trade them for power. He died in his garden by the sea, and his palace had a long afterlife he could never have imagined. When the storms of a later century came, the townspeople of the region moved inside its walls for safety and simply never left, building their houses into its halls, hanging their laundry between its columns, and the palace slowly became a city, which is still there tonight, called Split, on the Croatian coast, with about as many people living inside and around the old walls as the palace once held servants and guards, caff tables set out in the emperor's peristyle court, children's bicycles leaning against Roman columns, the sea air moving through the same stone gates, the gentlest possible fate for a house built by the man who reorganized the world. It became, at last, just a neighborhood, full of ordinary sleep. The orderly rule of 4 did not long survive its architect's retirement, because it had never solved the oldest problem, the sons, and among the sons and heirs who now manoeuvred for the pieces was a tall, forceful young officer named Constantine, whose father held the Western Command, and when the father died at York. That same grey northern fortress town where Severus had died a century before, the troops did the traditional thing and wrapped the son in purple on the spot. What followed was years of patient consolidation, and then a march on Rome itself against a rival, and on the night before the deciding battle at the Milvian Bridge, the old stone bridge over the Tiber just north of the city, Constantine, by his own account told later to the bishop who wrote his life, saw a sign in the sky, a cross of light over the sun with words attached, "In this sign conquer," and dreamed that night that he should mark his soldiers' shields with the monogram of Christ, and did, and won, his rival drowning in the river when the bridge of boats failed. Historians have weighed that story for 17 centuries, vision, dream, politics, sincere conversion growing over a lifetime, and the honest answer is that no one can audit another man's midnight. But what Constantine did in the light is a matter of record. Within months, meeting his Eastern colleague at Milan, he made it law that every person in the empire was free to follow whatever worship they chose. The persecutions were over, confiscated Christian property came back, and the faith that had spread for 3 centuries through the empire's kitchens and workshops and army camps, the faith of slaves and widows and dockworkers, tolerated at best, hunted at worst, walked blinking into the sunshine and found itself, within one more generation, sitting near the throne. Constantine poured the empire's resources into it, basilicas rising over the apostles' graves in Rome, his mother Helena travelling the Holy Land founding churches, and when the bishops fell to quarrelling over doctrine he summoned them all, at state expense, to a lakeside town called Nicaea and sat among them in his jewels, urging harmony, while they hammered out a creed that congregations still recite on Sunday morning 1600 years later. Rome itself, though, he saw with a strategist's cold eye. The city was a museum of glories 1,000 miles from any frontier that mattered, and the East held the money, the cities, the recruits. So on the European shore of the Bosporus, where a modest Greek town called Byzantium watched the ships pass between 2 seas, Constantine paced out, spear in hand, the boundaries of a new capital, and when his courtiers panted that he had walked too far, he answered that he would keep going until the one who walked before him stopped. 6 years of building later, in the spring of the year 330, the city of Constantine was dedicated. New Rome with a senate, a forum, endowed grain fleets, and 7 hills of its own if you counted generously. And the world's centre of gravity, which had sat on the Tiber for a millennium, slid quietly east, where it would remain, in that same city, under one name or another, for 11 more centuries. Constantine died in his 60s, baptized at last on his deathbed in a white robe, and the empire he left was again a family quarrel, but the current of the age ran on regardless. His nephew Julian, a bookish soldier-philosopher, raised half-prisoner in the new Christian court, tried in a brilliant, doomed 2-year reign to turn the tide back to the old gods, reopening temples, writing satires against his own capital's citizens when they laughed at his beard, and died young of a spear wound on a Persian campaign, and with him the old religion lost its last crowned friend, and the temples grew quiet, gradually, decade by decade, the eternal flame of Vesta in the Forum finally allowed to go out after 1,000 years of continuous tending. Not extinguished in violence, just, one evening, not renewed, the way an era actually ends, on an ordinary weekday without an announcement. The empire's halves were formally divided for the last time at the death of Theodosius, the final emperor to rule east and west alone, one son in Constantinople, one in the west, and the west story now quickens toward its long dusk. So let us take it gently, at a walking pace, with our coats on. The pressures were old, the frontier peoples were not invaders from nowhere, they were neighbours of 4 centuries standing, trading partners, army recruits, refugees, whole nations now, pushed from behind by the terrifying new power of the Huns riding off the steppe, and they wanted in, mostly, not to burn the empire, but to live inside its safety. The empire, short of money and soldiers and mercy, managed the pressure badly, admitting the Goths as refugees and then starving and cheating them until they became an army inside the walls. There were disasters and recoveries, a lost battle at Adrianople where an Eastern emperor fell, treaties, alliances, Gothic generals commanding Roman armies, and then, in the year 410, the thing that could not happen happened. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, a Christian, a former Roman ally exasperated beyond endurance by broken promises, camped before Rome, and on an August night someone opened the Salarian Gate, the old Salt Road Gate of the shepherds. And for 3 days his army helped itself to the movable wealth of the Eternal City. As sackings in that age went, it was almost restrained. The churches were declared sanctuary and largely respected. The buildings mostly stood. But the news went around the Mediterranean world like a physical shock. Rome, unconquered for 800 years since those long ago Gauls and the Geese, had fallen to a foreign king, and in his study in Bethlehem the scholar Jerome wrote that the city which had taken the whole world was itself taken, and his candle, you feel across the centuries, shook a little. Refugees carried the question everywhere, how could this happen? And in North Africa a bishop named Augustine spent 13 years answering it with a book called The City of God, arguing that no earthly city, however beloved, was ever the point, that all of them are tents pitched for a night, and that only the city not built with hands endures, a thought people have slept on in hard times ever since. Alaric himself outlived his famous 3 days by only months, dying of a fever in the south as he dreamed of leading his people to Africa, and legend says his followers turned a river aside, buried him in its bed with his treasures, and let the waters back over him, so that no one might ever disturb the man who had disturbed the world, and somewhere under a Calabrian river, the story would have it, he is sleeping still. The Western Court had long since left Rome for Ravenna, a strange, beautiful half-floating city on the Adriatic marshes, moated by lagoons, connected to the world by causeways, safe from armies and, its critics said, from reality. And there, among mosaics of deep blue and gold that visitors still stand under today, with their heads tipped back, the last act of the Western Empire played out, part tragedy, part administrative fade, like a great house being closed up room by room, the furniture sheeted, the staff let go one by one, while the family insists nothing at all has changed. For a while the house had one formidable manager, the general Aetius, called by later writers the last of the Romans, who spent 30 years juggling every crisis in the West, with an army increasingly made of the same frontier peoples he was managing, and his greatest hour came against the one enemy who frightened all the others, Attila the Hun. Attila had built, from the Hungarian plain, an empire of fear stretching from the Rhine toward the steppe, taking tribute in tons of gold from Constantinople itself, and the Romans who visited his wooden capital brought back the unsettling report that the master of this dread was a small, watchful, plainly dressed man who served his guests off wooden plates while his lieutenants ate from silver, drank sparingly, and seemed immune to luxury, which is, if you think about it, the most frightening detail of all. When Attila finally turned west, Aetius did the impossible. He assembled a coalition of Romans and Visigoths and Franks and Burgundians, yesterday's enemies shoulder to shoulder, and on the Catalonian plains of Gaul. In one enormous terrible day that we will leave folded up like a map, the Hun was for the only time turned back. The next year he came at Italy instead, and city after northern city opened or fell, refugees from one of them rowing out into their lagoon to squat on fishing islands that would grow, in time, into a city called Venice, so even the destruction was accidentally planting things. And then, at the river Mincio, Attila was met not by an army, but by an embassy, led in person by Leo, the Bishop of Rome, an old man in vestments riding out to talk to the terror of the world, and no one knows what was said, and Attila turned around. His own followers muttered about omens, historians add sensible footnotes about plague in the Hunnic camp and grain shortages and gold. But the picture the world chose to keep is the picture that mattered ever after, the unarmed old man and the conqueror talking quietly by a river, and the conqueror going home. Attila died within the year, on a wedding night of a burst blood vessel, and his empire, which had been held together by nothing but him, dissolved like a fist opening. Rome's relief was brief and self-inflicted. The Western emperor, jealous of his indispensable general, killed Aetius with his own hand at a palace meeting, and a courtier said afterward the only sentence anyone remembers from that whole sordid year, "Sir, you have cut off your right hand with your left." Within months the emperor himself was dead at the hands of Aetius's veterans, and in the vacuum the Vandal king, Gaiseric, who had walked his people across Gaul and Spain a generation earlier and seized Carthage's old province, the West's grain basket, sailed up the Tiber, and Leo went out once more to meet a conqueror at the gates, and won this time only limits: no burning, no killing, and for 14 days the Vandals methodically emptied the palaces of the Eternal City down to the gilded roof tiles, a plundering so businesslike that the word vandalism, coined much later, is honestly a little unfair to them. The last 20 years of the Western Empire are a corridor of flickering names, emperors raised and discarded by warlord kingmakers, one of them, Majorian, so able and so decent that his brief betrayed reign reads like a might have been, and the historian Gibbon paused over him to say that he presented the welcome discovery of a great and heroic character such as sometimes arise in a degenerate age to vindicate the honour of the human species. But the ledgers no longer balanced. Africa's grain was gone. Gaul and Spain were kingdoms in all but name. The army was a treaty with its own soldiers, and in the year 476 even the pretence ran out of budget. The last emperor in the West was a boy, and history, which does not usually write its own poetry, outdid itself with his name. He was called Romulus, after the founder, and Augustulus, little Augustus, both beginnings bundled into one child, a teenager pushed onto the throne by his ambitious officer father and never recognised by anyone who mattered. When the army's Germanic soldiers, led by an officer named Odoacer, demanded land in Italy and were refused, Odoacer removed the boy's father, and then did something almost tender by the standards of the age. He looked at the frightened boy in the purple, and saw no point in harming him. Romulus Augustulus was retired, with a generous pension, to a seaside villa in Campania, near Naples, a villa built centuries before by a friend of Augustus himself, and there he disappears from history, quietly, possibly living on for decades among the lemon trees, the only deposed emperor in the whole long story to be simply, mercifully, sent to bed. Odoacer did not bother to appoint a successor. He bundled up the imperial regalia, the diadem and the purple cloak, and shipped them east to Constantinople with a polite note, saying, in effect, one emperor is enough for the world, and he would govern Italy as king in that emperor's distant name. And the Senate of Rome, 1,229 years after the she-wolf, endorsed the letter. That is the famous fall of Rome. And you notice what is missing. There is no burning skyline, no last battle, no screaming. An administrative parcel travels down the Adriatic. A teenager waters his garden by the sea. In the streets of Rome that year the fountains ran as usual, the churches sang, the market argued about fish prices, and most people's lives on most days did not change at all, because the thing that had actually held their world together for centuries, the roads, the law courts, the bishops, the habits, kept running on momentum, the way a great wheel keeps turning long after the hand leaves it. And the empire itself did not die that day either. That is the part the school books used to skip. The eastern half, richer, more urban, better walled, sailed on from Constantinople, calling itself simply Roman, its people Romans, for another 1,000 years, minus 23, through plagues and sieges and golden ages, building Hagia Sophia's floating dome, preserving in its libraries the Greek learning that would one day recede the West, its law codified under Justinian into the very textbooks that Europe's law schools would study by candlelight centuries later, until at last, on a spring Tuesday in the year 1453, with cannon at the walls, that story too closed, an emperor named Constantine, like the founder of his city, dying at its gate. From Romulus to Romulus in the west, from Constantine to Constantine in the east, the whole thing bracketed like a well-made sentence, and even then it was not quite over. For Moscow called itself the Third Rome, and the Ottoman sultans styled themselves Caesars of Rome, and in Vienna and Aachen men wore the title Holy Roman Emperor until the year 1806, which means if you stretch the thread to its very end, that the name of Caesar was a living political title for over 18 centuries, worn last as Kaiser and Tsar by men with telephones on their desks. So the story is told, from the basket in the river to the parcel on the ship. And now, in the last quiet stretch of our night together, comes the gentlest question of all: where did it go? And the answer, which is the best possible answer for this hour, is nowhere. It is all still here. You are soaking in Rome tonight the way a shore soaks in an old tide. Start with the words. If you speak English, roughly 6 of every 10 words in your dictionary walked in from Latin, by way of French or straight from the source, and if you speak Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian or Romanian, you are not borrowing from Latin at all, you are speaking it. A Latin softened by 80 generations of goodnights, the camp slang of legionaries on the Danube become lullabies in Bucharest. The market Latin of Gaul become the French of love songs. When a Spanish mother tonight tells her child to sleep, duermi, she is using the same verb a Roman mother used on the Aventine when the geese were still on guard. Look at the month on your phone, July for Julius, August for his heir, the whole calendar Caesar's, leap day and all, trimmed once by a pope 16 centuries later and otherwise running exactly as designed, which makes it, quietly, the oldest piece of software in continuous use on Earth. The laws are still here. The idea that law must be written and public, from those 12 bronze tables. The idea that the accused is innocent until proven otherwise. That the burden of proof lies on the accuser. That a contract is a meeting of minds. That water flows and must be shared. All of it drafted in Roman courtrooms, codified in Constantinople, and carried into the codes of Europe and Latin America and beyond. So that a judge in Buenos Aires or Quebec or Manila tonight is, without thinking about it, citing Rome. The Republic is still here, more of it than the Empire, if you look closely. Senates sit in dozens of capitals, vetoes are cast, censuses are counted. Capitals are called capitals after the hill where the geese honked, and the architects of new republics, when they wanted to say liberty in stone, reached without hesitation for the columns and domes of Rome, which is why the government buildings of half the world are dressed as Roman temples, and why the eagle on so many flags and coins flew first over the legions. The engineering is not only still here, some of it is still working. The Pantheon's dome has not been out of service for a single generation in 1900 years. Bridges Roman soldiers built carry morning traffic in Spain and Portugal tonight, and the Alcantara bridge over the Tagus bears its original dedication. I have built a bridge which will last forever, an engineer's boast that is, so far, simply a fact. Roman concrete harbours still break waves, and modern engineers have finally worked out the recipe's secret. Seawater and volcanic ash knitting the material tighter over centuries so that the stuff literally heals itself while everything built beside it in the 1950s crumbles. Under the streets of Rome, the Cloaca Maxima of the ancient kings still carries stormwater, and across Europe, if a road on your map runs dead straight for 20 miles. You may be fairly sure whose surveyors set out its line, and in London and Paris and Cologne the modern city's street plan still bends around the ghost of the legionary fortress like a family living politely around a very old grandparent. And the quieter inheritances are the deepest. The book with pages you fell asleep over last night instead of a scroll, a Roman invention. The Codex, the letters these words were typed in, Roman capitals from the monuments, the small letters from the smooth-running hand of Roman clerks. The habit of the afternoon rest around the Mediterranean, the fountain in the town square, the apartment block, the newspaper. Caesar posted the Senate's daily acts in the Forum, the welfare grain that became the safety net, the fire brigade, the postal relay, the hospital, first built for legionaries, the very shape of a church, which is not a temple's shape at all, but a basilica's, a Roman law courts, because when the congregations came out of the shadows, they held their services in the architecture of justice. And the Bishop of Rome sits tonight where he has sat for 2,000 years, in a line unbroken from the fisherman who came to the capital under Nero, the last living institution of the empire, still using its title of chief bridge builder Pontifex Maximus, the priesthood Numa founded when the city was made of thatch. Even our fantasies are Rome's. Every tale of a chosen child raised in obscurity, every twin-founded city. Every wise mentor handing power back like Cincinnatus at his plough. Every story where a republic is loved and lost and mourned. The whole grammar of it was written on those 7 hills. And when filmmakers in our own age want to show a galactic republic falling to an emperor, they reach, every single time, without exception, for the plot you have just heard. So no, Rome did not fall. Not really. It dissolved, the way sugar dissolves, into everything, into the water supply, the word supply, the law, the calendar, the alphabet, the dreams, and that is why they call the city eternal. Not because the walls never broke, they broke, but because the thing the walls were protecting turned out to be portable, and every generation since has carried it on without being asked, the way you will carry some of it into your sleep tonight. And now the fire is very low, so let us go back one last time to where we began, because the very end of a story and the very beginning are always neighbours. It is night on the Tiber, any night, this night, and the river is doing what it has done since before the first shepherd, sliding brown and patient under its bridges, one of which, the broken one they call exactly that, Pontirotto, has a Roman arch still standing midstream, going nowhere, refusing to leave. Up on the Palatine the pines stand black against the stars over the buried floors of the palaces, and grass grows in the Circus Maximus where the chariots ran, and cats, the true last legion, patrol the forum among the fallen capitals. Past the spot where the Vestal flame burned for 1,000 years, past the black stone the Romans themselves believed marked the grave of Romulus, and the moon does what it has always done to marble, makes it look like it is dreaming. 28 centuries of nights have fallen on this riverbank, every single one of them, without exception, followed by a morning, nights of kings and consuls, of triumphs and plagues and coronations, the night the geese woke the hill, the night before the Rubicon, the night the ash fell on Pompey's bread ovens, the night Augustus asked for his applause, the night the philosopher wrote about the bees by lamplight, the night the regalia sailed east, and the city slept through nearly all of it, as cities do, as you should. Because sleep is the one empire that never falls. Somewhere out there tonight the wolf of the story still stands in bronze, ears pricked, patient, the 2 small boys beneath her, and she has waited out every emperor and every calamity without once changing her expression. And she will wait out this night too, which is, if you think about it, all any of us are asked to do, wait out the night, warmly, breathing slowly, while the river carries the last reflections downstream, past the sleeping wharves toward the sea. Another night, another fire, there are other worlds to walk through slowly, older ones and stranger ones, and they will keep, the way Rome kept, under the same patient stars. But that is for tomorrow. For now the lamps are out in the eternal city, the geese are quiet, the gates of the temple of Janus are closed, and the long, long story you have been carrying folds itself up at last like a blanket at the foot of the bed. Good night then from the 7 hills. Good night from the river that would not drown the twins. Sleep now, the she-wolf is watching, and mourning, as it always has.
Will come up over the forum, gold on old stone, in its own good time.